Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Abandoned Lighthouse guides no ships home. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Return to Blackwater Cove. The scent of salt and brine hit Evelyn Harper as she stepped out of her car. Blackwater Cove hadn't changed much in the decades since she'd left. Same weather-beaten houses, same narrow streets tangled with fog. She glanced up at the distant silhouette of the lighthouse, standing alone at the edge of the cliffs, its darkened frame watching over the ocean like a sentinel. The sight stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. It had been her brother's favorite place. That's why she was back. Decades had passed since he vanished, swallowed by the waves near the lighthouse, and no one had ever found a trace of him. The police wrote it off as an accident, but that had never sat right with her. She was 8, he was 12, and she had Felton had taken him. Now, as a marine historian researching shipwrecks along the East Coast, she had the perfect excuse to return. Officially, she was here to study the infamous wrecks along the cove. Unofficially, she needed answers. The locals didn't welcome her. At the corner store, eyes followed her every movement. Conversations died when she entered. The woman at the counter, hunched and gray with years, eyed her suspiciously as she paid for a bottle of water. "You're Harper's girl, ain't you?" the woman asked, her voice low and gravelly. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, I'm back for research." The woman's gaze darkened. "Best not go poking around that lighthouse," she warned. "Nothing but bad luck up there." Evelyn forced a smile, dismissing the old woman's words. She didn't believe in curses. She believed in cold, hard facts, in logic, but still, an uneasy chill crawled up her spine. The lighthouse had always had that effect on her, ominous and indifferent, as though it knew secrets no one else did. Driving out to the cliffs, later that afternoon, she caught sight of the lighthouse again, looming larger, its rusted exterior decaying with time. She pulled over, stepping out to take in the view. The waves crashed against the jagged rocks below, and for a moment she thought she saw something in the distance, a ship drifting far beyond the horizon, almost too faint to be real. She blinked, and it was gone. Her heart skipped, though she quickly brushed it off as a trick of the fog. Yet, as she stood there, staring at the lighthouse, an icy wind swept across her, cutting through her coat and settling into her bones. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. As she climbed back into her car, one thought lingered: maybe the town was right to stay away. Chapter 2. Whispers from the Past. The drive back from the cliffs was silent, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Even though she was alone, a presence seemed to linger in the car, heavy and cold. When she reached the small house she'd rented on the outskirts of Blackwater Cove, she slammed the door shut and stood still for a moment, listening. Only the distant roar of the ocean and the faint creaking of the old house filled the air. She needed answers. The next morning, Evelyn headed to the town library. Dusty shelves lined with worn volumes greeted her, and a musty smell hung in the air. Sitting in the far corner, she found an old newspaper archive with yellowed pages brittle under her fingers. It didn't take long before she found what she was looking for. Article after article mentioned the same thing: disappearances. Over the centuries, dozens of people had gone missing near the lighthouse. Fishermen, sailors, even children. None had ever been found. The librarian, a hunched-over man with watery eyes, noticed her reading. "Curious place, that lighthouse," he murmured, startling her. "Many come looking for answers, but none find what they seek. Best leave it alone. Evelyn nodded politely, though her mind raced. She wasn't going to be scared off by town superstition. She had already lost too much to that place. Later that day, Evelyn sought out Captain Matthews, the former lighthouse keeper. His house, perched on a cliff overlooking the cove, was as worn and weathered as the man himself. He opened the door with a grunt, his eyes narrowing when he recognized her. "I need to know about the lighthouse," Evelyn said, standing firm despite his glare. Captain Matthews shook his head, his face twisting in discomfort. "Some lights should never shine," he muttered. "That place, it's not for the living." "Why? What's really happening out there?" He didn't answer her. Instead, he slammed the door shut, leaving Evelyn standing in the biting wind with more questions than she came with. That night, the dreams began. In her sleep, she found herself standing at the base of the lighthouse, its once broken beam now slicing through a stormy sky. The sea below churned violently, and in the distance, ghostly ships appeared, their hulls cracked and their sails tattered. She heard her brother's voice, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. She awoke, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. The clock read 3:15 a.m., but something felt wrong. She pulled back the covers and gasped. Her sheets were covered in sand, cold and damp, as though the shore itself had crept into her bed. When she visited her old friend Grace the next day, the town journalist's face was pale. "You need to leave, Evelyn," she urged. "That lighthouse is cursed. Some things are better left forgotten." But Evelyn wasn't leaving. Not until she knew the truth. Chapter 3: The Lighthouse Beckons. Evelyn stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping her hair around her face. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its rusted frame towering against the stormy sky. Each step closer sent a chill down her spine, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to know what had happened to her brother, to the others who had disappeared near this cursed place. The warnings from Captain Matthews and Grace echoed in her mind, but they only fueled her determination. As she approached the lighthouse, the door creaked open on its own. Evelyn hesitated, her heart racing, but her feet carried her forward, past the threshold and into the darkness. Inside, the air was freezing, far colder than the wind outside. The damp smell of decay filled her nose, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows, but the light flickered as though the batteries were dying despite being fresh. She tapped it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Get it together," she whispered to herself, forcing her legs to move deeper into the lighthouse. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but as she moved up the spiral staircase, they grew louder. She paused, pressing her ear against the cold metal railing. The voices were unintelligible but insistent, surrounding her like a veil of sound. Her heart hammered in her chest. There was no one else here. There couldn't be. And yet, a shadow darted across the wall, just at the edge of her vision. Evelyn spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping over the empty hallway. Her skepticism began to waver. Logic couldn't explain the things she was seeing, hearing. She felt the weight of guilt settle heavily in her chest. She had always blamed herself for her brother's disappearance, for not watching him closely enough that day. What if it was her fault? What if she had led him to his death? Shaking the thought away, Evelyn continued her search, her fingers trembling as she ran them along the peeling wallpaper. She stumbled across a small room near the top of the lighthouse. Dust coated every surface, but in the corner, she spotted something out of place, an old, leather-bound journal, half hidden beneath a pile of rotting wood. She opened it, the pages yellowed and brittle. The entries started like any lighthouse log weather patterns, passing ships, but the later pages grew frantic, the handwriting erratic. One phrase appeared over and over again, the curse of the light. Evelyn's eyes widened as she reached the final, desperate entry, the light. It calls them ships that were never meant to come home. And now it calls me. A shiver ran down her spine. Something was very wrong with this place, and whatever it was, it had claimed her brother. And now, it seemed, it was calling for her too. Chapter 4. The Dead Return. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, the journal still clutched tightly in her hands. The weight of the final entry lingered in her mind, heavy and suffocating. The light, it calls them. She tried to shake the words away, but they clung to her like damp sea air. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from Grace. You need to stop, Ev. Whatever's happening with that lighthouse, it's not worth your sanity or your life. She stared at the message, fingers trembling over the screen. But what did Grace know? She hadn't lost a brother to that cursed place. She hadn't seen the things Evelyn had seen. The whispering started again. It came from the walls, soft at first, like the wind, but then it grew louder. It wasn't just whispering this time, there were footsteps too. Heavy, deliberate steps, pacing just beyond her bedroom door. She stood up, her body tense. Hello? She called out, her voice shaky in the dead silence of the house. No answer, but the footsteps continued. Slowly, she crept toward the door, her hands shaking as she turned the knob. The hallway was empty, bathed in darkness, but the chill in the air was unmistakable. She could feel it, deep in her bones. She wasn't alone. Suddenly, something moved in the corner of her vision. She whipped her head around and gasped. For just a fleeting second, there he was, her brother, standing at the end of the hallway. His small figure was pale and ghostly, his eyes wide and empty. He raised a hand, beckoning her. "Jamie," she whispered, her heart racing. But in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps. She closed the door and leaned against it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Was she losing her mind? Or was her brother really there, calling out to her? The following morning, Evelyn knew she needed answers. She found Captain Matthews sitting at the harbor, staring out at the sea. He looked older than before, more worn, as if the weight of the lighthouse's curse had aged him overnight. "The light," he said before she could ask, his voice a hollow rasp. "It's been calling them for centuries. Ships that had no business being in these waters, drawn to their doom. And your brother, he was one of them, Evelyn. The lighthouse wanted him." Her skin crawled at his words. Why him? Why anyone? "No one knows," Matthews muttered, his eyes clouded with something darker than fear. "But every keeper, since the wreck of the Sable Star, has been doomed. Disappeared, dead, or worse." Evelyn's heart pounded. "What do you mean, worse?" Matthews shook his head, his gaze distant. "They become part of it. The lighthouse takes them. The light isn't just a beacon, Evelyn. It's a trap. It pulls you in till you're lost, just like Jamie." That night, Evelyn's dreams returned with a vengeance. The lighthouse's beam swept across the stormy sea, but this time she was inside the tower, staring out into the abyss. Her brother's voice echoed in the wind, closer now, almost tangible. But the light, it was pulling her, drawing her in like a moth to the flame. She awoke with a start, her chest heaving. The curse was real. The light wanted her to. Chapter 5. The Curse Revealed. Evelyn could barely keep her thoughts together as she pored over old maps, historical documents, and weathered books she'd borrowed from the town library. Her hands trembled as she flipped through a brittle, yellowed page, the words blurring together. The revelations from Captain Matthews haunted her every step. Her brother's ghostly figure still lingered in her mind, but something darker, more twisted, seemed to hover over everything now. Blackwater Cove had always been shrouded in mystery, but she was beginning to piece together a horrifying puzzle. The lighthouse was more than just a beacon. It was a grave marker, resting on cursed land where the souls of sailors were never given peace. They had been lured to their deaths, not by the sea, but by the malevolent hand of the first lighthouse keeper, a man named Samuel Barron. Evelyn read the account with growing dread. Barron had been a respected figure in the town, but hidden beneath his stoic demeanor was a dark secret. In 1824, he had made a deal with something far older than the town itself, a twisted force that promised him power in exchange for souls. One by one, ships that sailed too close to Blackwater Cove were lured by the false light of the tower, smashing into the jagged rocks below. Those sailors had never been laid to rest, and their spirits, betrayed by Barron, now roamed the waters and the cliffs, bound by the curse. Evelyn's pulse quickened. The journal she had found in the lighthouse mentioned Barron, but it was too damaged to make sense of the last entries. She needed to go back to find the missing pieces. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Evelyn shivered as she heard a faint creaking noise. Her breath hitched. She turned toward the door and froze. There, in the doorway, was her brother again, pale, translucent, his eyes dark and hollow. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was unmistakable. His lips parted, and though no sound came out, Evelyn knew what he was saying. "Come to the lighthouse." Her heart raced as she gasped for air, squeezing her eyes shut. When she opened them again, he was gone. The curse was alive. It had been waiting, perhaps for years, dormant until she returned. Evelyn's skin prickled with fear. The lighthouse wasn't haunted by ordinary spirits. It was under the control of something far worse, something that wanted her, just like it had claimed Barron and all the others. As the days passed, the strange occurrences only intensified. Her dreams were no longer contained to the night. In the daylight hours, she found herself standing at the edge of the cliffs, the lighthouse looming in the distance. She couldn't remember how she got there, only that she felt its pull, a magnetic force urging her closer to the rocks. She'd woken up in the dead of night, standing outside her home, her feet bare and cold. She had been sleepwalking, drawn toward the lighthouse, like a puppet on invisible strings. She could feel it pulling her deeper into its curse. Each night, the beam from the tower flickered in her dreams, and each night, she heard her brother's voice calling her name. Her grip on reality was slipping, and the line between nightmare and waking life had all but vanished. She could see it now, the dark figure of Samuel Barron standing atop the lighthouse, watching her, waiting. His deal with the darkness wasn't finished yet. Evelyn knew she had to break the curse, or she'd become just another victim, another soul claimed by the lighthouse. Chapter 6: Descent into Madness. Evelyn couldn't tell what was real anymore. Every corner she turned, every shadow she glimpsed, seemed to carry the echo of her brother's voice. His name haunted her. She had spent so many nights chasing it in her dreams, hearing his whispers from the cliffs, seeing his pale figure slipping into the fog. It wasn't just dreams anymore. The line between night and day blurred into a nightmare that felt endless. The lighthouse's pull became unbearable. Even in her waking hours, she could see the beam slicing through the night, feel the weight of it dragging her toward the sea. The journal entries, the old town maps, and Captain Matthews' words all ran through her mind in a disjointed loop. It was the curse. It was the lighthouse. And now it was inside her. Her obsession consumed her. Grace tried to reach out. Her calls went unanswered. Her knocks on Evelyn's door ignored. Evelyn had distanced herself from everyone, convinced they didn't understand. No one believed her, not truly. Only she could break the curse. Only she could bring her brother back. But she didn't want to be around them anymore. The longer she stayed in the town, the more the lighthouse clawed into her mind, unraveling her thoughts, twisting her sense of reality. She hadn't slept in days, afraid of the nightmares, afraid of what the darkness would reveal. The hallucinations began soon after. Ships, ghostly ships appeared along the shoreline, their broken hulls lit by the beam of the lighthouse. Some nights, they drifted so close, she swore she could hear the creaking of their weathered decks, the faint moans of the long-dead crew. But when she blinked, they were gone. The visions became stronger with each passing day, as if the lighthouse was opening a window between this world and the one trapped beneath the sea. She saw her brother everywhere, standing in her hallway, at the edge of the cliff, beckoning her from the shore. His presence gnawed at her sanity, his face an eerie blend of the boy she remembered and something more sinister, his eyes vacant yet pleading. The guilt she had suppressed for decades resurfaced like a crashing wave. Why didn't you save him? The question echoed in her head until she became certain there was only one way to fix it. She had to surrender. She had to give in to the pull of the lighthouse. Her heart pounded as she stood by the window, staring at the distant glow of the tower. The light seemed different tonight, its beam slow and deliberate, as if it was calling only to her. The urge to follow grew stronger, gnawing at the fragile threads of her sanity. She clutched the edge of the windowsill, her knuckles white. Her brother's face appeared again, flickering at the edge of her vision, always out of reach. His voice drifted through the room. "Come to the light, Evie. I'm waiting." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I'll bring you back, I promise." Her breath hitched, the reality of her promise sinking in. Her mind fought to hold on, but she was slipping just like all the others before her. The journal's frantic last entries replayed in her head, the handwriting scrawled with terror. The curse of the light. It takes us all. She wasn't sure if she was losing her mind, or if she had already lost it. But Evelyn could feel it, the curse tightening its grip, drawing her ever closer to the lighthouse's deadly embrace. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only way to save him. Chapter 7. Confrontation with Darkness. Evelyn knew there was no turning back. The pull of the lighthouse had become unbearable, its beckoning light casting a sickly glow across the cliffs. She stepped outside into the frigid night, the wind howling against her, as if it, too, was trying to warn her away. But Evelyn was past the point of fear. There was only a grim determination left. Truth was waiting inside that tower, and whatever it cost, she would face it. The lighthouse loomed ahead, a black silhouette against the churning sea. As she crossed the rocky path to its base, she felt a heavy weight settle over her chest, making each breath a struggle. The door creaked open without her touch, as if the lighthouse was welcoming her, eager to reveal its secrets. Inside, the air was thick with cold, damp, and oppressive. Her flashlight flickered wildly, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked walls. She made her way up the spiral staircase, the wood groaning beneath her boots. With each step, the atmosphere grew darker, more suffocating, until it felt like the tower was breathing around her. At the top, the light blazed to life, its beam sweeping slowly over the water, illuminating something that made her heart freeze, a ghostly shipwreck. The ship, a twisted, decaying mass of wood and iron, was caught in the lighthouse's beam, and along its decks stood figures. Transparent, hollow-eyed figures. The lost souls the light had guided to their doom. A voice echoed through the tower, low and cruel. They were never meant to be saved. Evelyn spun around and came face to face with the spirit of the original keeper, his form flickering like a shadow in the darkness. His eyes glowed with malice, and his smile was cold as death. "The light," he rasped, "was my gift to them. A guide to the end. And now it calls you too." Evelyn's heart raced as the truth hit her. The keeper had made a pact with something ancient, something dark. His light had led countless ships to their destruction, feeding whatever force haunted this place. And now it wanted her. "No," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "You took my brother. You're not taking me." The keeper's laugh echoed through the tower, chilling her to the bone. "Your brother belongs to the light now. Just like you will." Evelyn's breath hitched as she glanced toward the window. There, standing among the ghostly crew of the wrecked ship, was her brother. His eyes met hers, pleading, as the light's beam swept over him, holding him in place. He reached out toward her, his lips forming the word, "Help." Tears welled in her eyes, but she knew she had no choice. The lighthouse was alive, its cursed light twisting reality, warping everything around her. The walls seemed to close in, the floor shifting beneath her feet, trapping her in a nightmare. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks echoed louder and louder, as if the sea itself was rising to swallow her. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she faced the keeper. "I won't be like you," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I won't be consumed." The light intensified, searing through the fog, and the tower trembled as if resisting her. But Evelyn fought back. She grabbed the keeper's journal from her bag, the one that told the story of the curse, and hurled it into the light's beam. The pages caught fire, burning in the spectral glow. The tower shuddered violently, the walls cracking as the keeper's furious scream filled the air. In the chaos, Evelyn ran. Down the stairs, through the freezing dark, with the sound of the shipwreck and the ghosts of the dead chasing her. She didn't stop until she was free of the lighthouse's grasp, standing on the cliffs with the wind whipping her hair, her brother's distant plea still ringing in her ears. The curse had nearly claimed her, but she wasn't done yet. Chapter 8. The Light Fades. Evelyn stood on the cliffs, gasping for air, the lighthouse's shadow stretching behind her like a dark stain on the earth. The beam had finally flickered out, leaving only the sound of the crashing waves and the echo of the wind. Her body trembled, her legs barely holding her up as she stared out at the sea, the ghostly shipwreck now swallowed by the night. It was over, or at least she hoped it was. But the silence felt wrong. Too heavy, too still. Evelyn's heart pounded, her mind racing as she recalled the horrors she had faced inside that cursed tower. The keeper's voice still whispered in her ears, his cruel promise that she too would belong to the light. And her brother, she had seen him, had nearly touched him. The pain in her chest twisted as the memory of his pleading eyes haunted her. With shaking hands, she wiped the tears from her face. She couldn't stay here. Not anymore. She glanced back at the lighthouse one last time, its rusted shell looming in the darkness. The tower seemed more decayed now, its structure cracked and crumbling, as if the curse that had fueled it for centuries was finally withering away. But Evelyn knew better. She'd seen too much to believe that the nightmare was truly over. The locals would never believe her. She imagined how they'd look at her now, with the same suspicious eyes that had followed her since she first arrived. Grace had already distanced herself, telling Evelyn to let the past stay buried. No one would understand what had really happened here. They'd say she was mad, broken by grief and the loss of her brother. And maybe they wouldn't be entirely wrong. She started walking down the path, the wind biting at her skin, the town's distant lights barely visible. The night was too quiet, the shadows too deep. Every step she took felt like a reminder that the darkness still lingered, clinging to her, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As she reached the edge of the town, Evelyn stopped, glancing back once more. The lighthouse stood silent, its beam long extinguished. But in that silence, she could still feel it watching, waiting. She swallowed hard, knowing that even though she had escaped, a part of her had been claimed. There was no undoing what had been done, no erasing the horrors she'd witnessed. In the end, she had destroyed the lighthouse, or perhaps it had destroyed itself. But the question remained, had she really ended the curse, or had it simply taken on a new form, one that would follow her for the rest of her days? Evelyn turned her back on the town, on the lighthouse, and walked into the unknown, knowing that no matter where she went, the darkness would always be just one step behind.